Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julia Grimes, the Deputy Director of the Dunhuang Foundation, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon on behalf of the Foundation. It's my honor to introduce today's speaker, Matt Kimberley. Matt Kimberley is a researcher curator on Cotanese at the British Library. In 2017, he curated the exhibition Illuminating India, 5,000 Years of Science and Innovation at the Science Museum, London. He was also previously the Clay Sanskrit Library Program Officer at the Bodleian Libraries, University of Oxford, where he worked on promoting classical Indian language, literature, and culture to schools and public audiences. He has a particular interest in the dissemination of Indian thought along the Silk Roads, currently focused on the history of medicine. Matt's topic this afternoon will be the transmission of medical knowledge along the Silk Roads with reference to Khotanese sources. Without further ado, please join me now in welcoming him.
Good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, or good night, depending on where in the world you're tuning in from today. It's a real pleasure to be doing this for the Dunhuang Foundation. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, Julia, for the introduction. Yes, as Julia says, today I'm going to talk a bit about the transmission of medical knowledge along the Silk Roads, with particular reference to Khotanese sources. So actually, before I get into it, I'll start with some caveats. I'm not an historian of medicine by training or by main work, nor am I a botanist or a pharmacist. My interest is just in the history of ideas, and particularly in this incredibly fascinating region of the world. I'm a collector of unloved things. If my interest is in anything, Cotanese needs a lot more love than it receives. So actually that's the kind of thing that first drew me to it. And before that, even to Carian, actually my first interest in the Silk Roads came from the transmission of Jatakas and the variant forms that they showed as they transmitted out of India. So it was only when I joined the British Library off the back of the Science Museum exhibition, I decided I might turn my attention to the history of medicine and settled upon one very peculiar little manuscript called the Jīvakapustaka, which will be one of the main focuses of what I talk about today. So that's enough of me in person. I'll take you over to my PowerPoint now and leave you, for a short while anyway, on the lovely map, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with from some point in time, if not regularly. It features in Susan Whitfield and Ursula Sims Williams' book on the Silk Road that accompanied their exhibition here at the British Library. And as I sort of begin to talk about the contextual information in this paper, it gives you something to focus on and summon up the images and imagination of this part of the world as we talk about how they practice medicine there. So, as for this paper, it actually originally began life a little over a year ago, shortly before the rest of our lives were generally put on hiatus, as an overview of medical manuscripts discovered on the Silk Roads. At that time, originally, I planned to give a talk summarizing all of the material that had been found in Sanskrit, the Prakrits, Khotanese, Tacarian, and Uyghur. Frankly, quite simply to save other people spending as much time as I had on an ERC-funded research project, just trying to hunt down this information across many an obscure journal and synthesize it all. I don't read Uyghur, however, the number of sources are relatively few in that, so I included them in this. What I have intentionally omitted are Chinese and Tibetan medical texts, not because they aren't profoundly significant. They are, of course, a hugely important part of medical practices in this region, but rather because I neither speak Chinese nor Tibetan, and they're entirely distinct medical traditions from the Indic one that require a much deeper contextual understanding of those traditions, which I myself lack. So the kind of medicine I'll be talking about today very much is that from the Indic tradition and how that was received along the Silk Roads. The key to doing all of this work, particularly, was the scholarship of Ronald Emmerich, who spent decades investigating the topic of medicine, particularly Khotanese medicine, and was undoubtedly the foremost authority in this area. One paper in particular that he wrote called Contributions to the Study of the Jīvakapustaka as by far and away the richest source of information for everything we'll be talking about today. So I've mentioned it a couple of times now. The Jīvakapustaka is a Cotanese manuscript of pharmaceutical prescriptions. In the paper, among other things, Emmerich identifies sources in Indian medical literature with parallels to the prescriptions in the Jīvakapustaka. So it was by exploring this further, specifically in relation to the other main manuscript I'll talk about today, the Nāvanītakam from the Bauer manuscript, that I uncovered a set of previously unidentified correlations. The results of this reinforced the suspicion that I'd had for some time, following the arguments of a number of other researchers, such as Kenneth Zisk and Pierre Salguero, about the origins and circulations of medical knowledge among the cultures of the Silk Roads. So with all this in mind, I'll begin by setting out what those textual sources from the region are, and then delve more deeply into the two aforementioned works. However, before I do that, even, in light of discussing this with a colleague about half an hour ago, as I imagine many of you find when you're doing research, you spend such a long time burying yourself in it that you sometimes completely forget nobody else has been doing exactly the same thing, and you might need to provide a bit more context. So I actually thought I should probably say a bit about Khotan and the Cotanese before I even do that. Not, of course, that we aren't all incredibly familiar with them, but it certainly wouldn't hurt for a bit of additional context. So, located on the southwestern side of the Taklamakan Desert, Khotan was the kingdom of an Eastern Iranian people. The earliest accounts of Khotan in historical records come from China during the latter half of the 2nd century BCE. During the early centuries of the Common Era, Khotan comes under the cultural influence of the Kushans, and it's during this period that Buddhism was likely adopted in the region, as traders and Buddhist monks sent out from the kingdom of Gandhara on missions. From the 5th to 7th century CE, Chinese sources, we learn that Khotan was a thriving center of Mahayana Buddhism, with reportedly over 100 monasteries and thousands of monks. Reports say that these Khotanese monasteries housed thousands of manuscripts of Buddhist texts, and Khotanese Buddhist monks were instrumental in translating Sanskrit and Prakrit works into Chinese during the early reception of Buddhism in China. Writing in Khotan also began with the arrival of Buddhism. At first, Buddhist texts appeared in the Middle Indic language of Gandhari, Prakrit, which would, in the very earliest instances, have been written in the Koroshi script. Many of the earliest written texts in Khotan are in the form of padas, or two wood slips bound together with hemp string. However, manuscripts in which the Khotanese wrote their own language and literature use another variety of early Indic script from North India known as Brahmi, of which you'll see some examples as we go through today. With its transmission to Central Asia, the Brahmi script began to undergo changes, producing two major types, North and South Pakistan Brahmi, named for the routes around the Taklamakan Desert on which they were found. Manuscripts from the Khotan area can be tentatively dated to the 5th to 6th century CE and preserve the Old Khotanese form of the language. Middle Khotanese is dated to the 7th to 8th century, and manuscripts tend to come from Khotan and nearby cities such as Kadalik, Nia, and Dandanulik. You can see how very close they are if you spotted Khotan on the map. Then from the 8th to 10th century, our extant late Khotanese manuscripts come from Dunhuang, of course, most particularly the famous library cave, which is located on the opposite side of the Taklamakan Desert, some 2,000 kilometers away. So, with that brief synopsis of Khotan taken care of, let's turn our attention back to medicine. The attested story of medicine on the Silk Roads does in fact begin with one of today's main subjects, the Nāvanītakam, which, as I say, forms part of something called the Bauer manuscript. The Bauer manuscript is so called because it was obtained by a Lieutenant Bauer in 1890. The manuscript was discovered by some local treasure hunters about 15 miles from the city of Kucha, one of the historic cities of the Tacarians of the Northern Silk Route. It was housed in the relic chamber of a memorial stupa built for a Buddhist monk named Yashamitra. Throughout the 1890s and 1900s, the manuscript was studied by Hernley, who eventually produced a volume of facsimiles of the manuscript itself and another volume of its transliteration and translation, together with an introduction presenting an overview of Hernley's research. The Bauer manuscript is in fact a collection of 7 distinct manuscripts with separate pagination, not all of which survive in completion. It's written in what is affectionately known as Sanskrit of a non-classical variety, or mixed Sanskrit as he refers to it at points. That is to say, the Sanskrit does not follow the strict rules of Paninian grammar. To digress for a moment, it often makes me laugh the way in which perhaps some so very rigidly stick to an idea of what Sanskrit is. I think, particularly as you'll find with Central Asian sources and often with Buddhist literature in a wide range of genres, there were many a kind of Sanskrit written and spoken across India and Central Asia over many, many centuries. What variety of Sanskrit this is very hard to say. It's not a Prakrit, it is not a distinct regional dialect that we know of from the traditional Prakrits. But one of the problems in trying to describe the Sanskrit that we have in the Nāvanītakam is that there has never actually been a comprehensive and systematic study of the use of Sanskrit in Central Asia. So it's really very hard to say whether or not this is a specific local regional dialect of the language or just the middle ground between various different speakers of Prakrit and Sanskrit that was mutually intelligible to all. The script in which it's written, as you can see there, is the Gupta script, prevailing in the northern region of India from the 4th to 6th centuries of the Common Era, and not one of the Turkestan Brahmi scripts I'd mentioned earlier that would arise in Central Asia at a later date. Largely a result of the paleographical features of the manuscript, Hernley assumes the Bau manuscript to have been produced no later than the 4th century. We know that the manuscript is a copy of an earlier work from details such as dots written by the scribe where he couldn't clearly read what certain characters were, and therefore must have been copying from an original version, and from mistaken inclusion of marginalia and or interlinear comments into the main text. Hernley proposes a date of the 2nd century for the composition of the original, which he does in part on the basis of relative chronology of other medical texts. I am not a scholar of Ayurvedic medicine by any means, and I can't testify to the validity of his arguments. In fact, the great scholar of Indian medical history, Mullenbeld, found them to be dubious, even if he actually agreed that the date postulated seemed quite likely. So, what really is the Nāvanītakam? Well, the first 3 manuscripts or parts of the Bau manuscript are all medical treatises, and it's number 2, with which I'm mainly concerned here, the Nāvanītakam. It is a collection of formulae, pharmaceutical prescriptions, compiled from existing Indian medical law at the time of its composition. In it, both Veda and Shushruta, authors of some of the great classical Ayurvedic works, are mentioned by name, but it doesn't seem as though at this point in time the classical Ayurvedic Samhitas had actually yet fully taken shape. The works aren't referred to in a systematic way or included in clear reference, but the names are, and therefore we assume that aspect of the Ayurvedic tradition was in development. It's organized into chapters according to the base of the prescriptions. So, for instance, chapter 1 is powdered medicine linked to scissor pills. Chapter 2, medicated ghee. Chapter 3, medicated oils, and so on. This is certainly different from how pharmacy was arranged in the famous Samhitas, and hence the need to draw a distinction. Classical Ayurvedic works, such as those of Charaka and Shushruta, categorize their pharmaceutical prescriptions by groups of drugs and what they're used to treat. In the Nāvanītakam, in almost all instances, each prescription has a name, normally reflective of the main ingredient in the formula. So this is where our knowledge and understanding of medicine on the Silk Road begins. It is by some way, by a good number of centuries, the earliest manuscript, and one that very clearly is an importation of Indian medical traditions into the Central Asian region. So next up, I'm going to start talking about some of the other textual sources we have. Like anyone writing a paper, I actually spent a huge amount of time chopping and changing all the various sections of this talk and then going, maybe I should talk about it this way. Maybe in fact it needs to be arranged that way. Should I do this chronologically? Should I do it by language and culture? Should I do it by textual structure? And none of them ever quite seem to work as the best way to go about it. So in the end, I settled on doing it by language culture group in a roughly chronological order. But after we've gone through it, I'll show you an actual timeline of where we think these texts fall. So moving on from the mixed non-classical Sanskrit, we'll come to Tocharian. The main medical work preserved in Tocharian B is the Jīvakapustaka. This text is generally thought to have been written sometime prior to the 7th century of the Common Era and is frequently attributed to the great Buddhist thinker Nagarjuna. What it consists of is pharmaceutical prescriptions of compound medicines based on the 8 divisions of Ayurveda, and as the text itself is divided into 12 chapters. Also, as mentioned here, this comes in the North Turkestan variety of Brahmi, unlike Khotanese, which is in the southern type. As I say, the Tocharian version probably dates from the mid-7th century, and unfortunately, the manuscript is very much incomplete. While it does preserve pharmaceutical prescriptions, what it contains no trace of is the Ayurvedic medical theory that underpins them in the Indian context. Instead, what we seem to have is just a compendium of useful pharmaceutical prescriptions. This is a point that I'm going to return to again and again later on. Further to that, Tocharian also preserves assorted fragments, 70 of which have been published, and there are an unknown number of unpublished and unexamined ones. Just as a side note, there's a project which has started very recently in Paris, Histoc Text, which is aiming to fully catalogue and describe their entire Tocharian collection there. I'm very much looking forward to seeing the results of this, as it might help shed a lot of light on what else we have in medical knowledge from the Tocharians. Certainly I do know some of these fragments are other sections of the Jīvakapustaka, and some would appear to be from the Siddhasara, about which I'll speak next. So we'll move from Tocharian to Cotanese and south on the Silk Road. Cotanese medicine is primarily preserved in 2 works, both found in the famous library cave at Dunhuang, and therefore likely dated to the 9th to 10th century. The first of these is the Siddhasara. It's a work placed in the classical Indian Ayurvedic tradition, composed or collated by a man named Ravigupta in the mid-7th century. Traditionally, the great medical works by authors such as Shushruta, Charaka, and Bhagavata were divided by discipline or method: surgery, etiology, gynecology, toxicology, ophthalmology, etc. Instead, with the Siddhasara, we get a turning point in the history of Indian medicine, in that the arrangement is instead of 31 chapters that organize the prescriptions according to the different ailments they treat. So one thing I have really enjoyed discovering and coming into the world of studying the history of medicine is the incredibly gory and, as we say, well, suffice to say, the kinds of topics that aren't normally reserved for the austere study of like religious texts where I started out. So we have here the chapter on diarrhea, the chapter on disease of loose urine, whatever that may mean, and indeed an entire chapter committed to piles. Medical history is a wonderfully different and exciting world to study from things I've seen in the past. But it is important to stress here, this is really quite a radical new way of structuring pharmaceutical knowledge for this time, and goes on to have an enormous influence. So Ravigupta's model is later adopted by Madhava in his medical work at the beginning of the 8th century, after which it starts to become a standard formula. We know from the text that Ravigupta came from what is simply referred to as the West, and was the son of a veterinary doctor. This is all according to also a lot of the work that Mullenbell did on tracing the history of Indian medical literature. Attempts to identify him from numerous Indian and Tibetan sources suggest that he was a Buddhist and established the cult of Tara, possibly in the Kashmiri region. If this were the case, it would help to explain why the Siddhasara circulated in Central Asia and Tibet, rather than the earlier non-Buddhistic Ayurvedic works. Further distinctiveness of the Siddhasara is seen in the verses themselves, which do not seem to carry on the earlier tradition. While Bhagavata draws heavily on Shushruta and Charaka, Ravigupta appears to use almost entirely new or different sources. This is something which Emmerich explored in great depth. This begs a great many questions about what those sources could be and why there was such a sudden and significant shift. My final point on the Siddhasara is that, as I say, it exists in Sanskrit. It's original from sometime in the 7th century. We have Cotanese here from the 9th, 10th century, but also a Tibetan recension from the 9th century, which the Cotanese seems to draw upon both Tibetan and Sanskrit in its translation. There is also a very fragmentary version of it in Uyghur, which I'll come to later, that must be prior to the 13th century, but as we all know in these fields, dating is a thorny issue. But beyond that, the text reach goes much further, being cited in Arabic translation by Razez. And it's by this route that eventually it even entered European medicine in the medieval period. It really is a work of enormous significance and has shaped a lot of, as you can see, all of Eurasian history of medicine. However, regardless of its progression west, it was undoubtedly a great deal of importance in Asia during the latter half of the first millennium, and that's where we're focusing today. So, on to the second of the Khotanese works, and my personal favourite, the Jīvakapustaka. As I mentioned, they were found by Orlstein in the famous library cave of Dunhuang, and so cannot be dated any later than 1000 Common Era. It's a Sanskrit Khotanese bilingual work, as in fact is the Siddhasara, and it was written in a very cursive ductus of South Turkestan Brahmi. Just to go back for a moment there, look at that beautiful Siddhasara manuscript with this nice formal ductus elegantly presented on the page, clearly a work of value. And then let's look at the Jīvakapustaka, wobbling about all over the place in a poorly discernible hand, with not an enormous amount of respect for sticking to the line. In the first part of the manuscript, it alternates between Sanskrit then Cotanese, one clause at a time. But in the later parts of the manuscript, as it progresses, you get longer and longer passages without correlation. The scribe certainly, and the author probably, if they are two separate people, were Cotanese. How do we know this? Well, the Sanskrit of the text is incredibly bad, suggesting that the scribe and or author did not have a very good knowledge of the language. As I say, of course, there is a tendency among Sanskritists to get very proper and formal about good Sanskrit and correct Sanskrit. And when I first started reading articles about this subject, everyone kept talking about the terrible Sanskrit. And my gut reaction was to go, oh, this is just Sanskritists being unfair on some slightly non-Parninian grammar. Then I actually read the text and was like, no, this is really very terrible Sanskrit. This is clearly not a Sanskritist. That said, the Cotanese is also very irregular for late Cotanese. The spelling is quite inconsistent, sometimes very hard to read. And so it does lead me to suspect the scribe may not have had the highest level of literacy in general. Structurally, and this is one of the most interesting things about the text, it's remarkably similar to the Nāvanītakam. So the Jīvakapustaka, its pagination starts partway through. We don't know what was preceding this. It does have an opening colophon, so we feel like it's the start, but the numbering doesn't start at 1. More problematically, it clearly finishes without concluding, and we just don't know how much more text there was. So all we can say for certain is that it had at least 4 chapters. The first is an antidote, the second is medicated ghees, the third medicated oils, and the fourth powdered medicines, as we can see, already quite resembling the early parts of the Nāvanītakam. The prescriptions are also very similar in format, although somewhat more florid in style. An important difference between the Sanskrit and Cotanese passages that I'll come back to again is that the Cotanese portions add a lot more information about quantities, weights, measures, and preparation processes. In his introduction to his translation of the Jīvakapustaka, Konov notes that it resembles the Bauer manuscript in being a compilation, and these seem to be popular in Chinese Turkestan. I very much agree with him on that, and that will be one of the main points of consideration in this paper today. Furthermore, I said there are 2 main texts. In addition to that, we've got some smaller works on a scroll, part of which is in the British Library, and part of which is at the Bibliothèque Nationale, is a text on poultices. How it ended up being split in half is an odd and interesting story, and Mauro Maggi did an excellent article in which he put these 2 back together and explained something of the origin of these texts. It's probably a late Cotanese composition, 9th, 10th century, but unknown. As you'd expect Khotanese, it's a South Turkestan Brahmi script, regular ductus, and it's a list of prescriptions for poultices. arranged according to where they're applied on the body. What does make this particularly interesting text is that there is no identified source material for it as yet. And I very much hope we do make progress in establishing where it could have originated. Also, as with Tocharian, there are assorted fragments. Now, these are listed here. Certainly, I've sifted through these and tried to see where they may be from. Definitely a few are from the Siddhasara, and with enough time and painstaking work, it might be possible to establish they all are, given that that's the other main text of Cotanese. So, finally, for this section on to Uyghur, I did try to find some digitized images of the manuscripts, but to absolutely no avail. So I'm afraid you just get a blank screen at this point while I talk about these. Now, it's a very brief section, so don't worry. There are two main sources. We have Uyghur medical practices deriving from the Indian tradition during this time, and they are parts of translations of Ravi Gupta's Siddhasara and Vagbhata's Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita. As with the other texts already mentioned, the distinctive quality about these is that they are fairly loose translations with substantial innovative material added on the subject of quantities for ingredients and details of preparation methods. So, as I said, it helps to try and organize all of this with a bit of a timeline so you can see what we've got. Beginning with the Bauer manuscript in probably the 4th century, somewhere in the western regions, northwest regions of India would have been composed the Yoga Shataka sometime prior to the 7th century. Then not long after that, the Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita by Vagbhata. It wouldn't be long after this that we get the Tocharian recension of the Yoga Shataka. Emmerich puts a date fairly confidently around the mid-7th century for the Siddhasara in Sanskrit. Then the Tibetan version in the 9th, the Cotanese in the 9th to 10th. We know it must have come after because, as I say, it clearly uses content from both the Tibetan and the Sanskrit versions in its composition. Sometime around the same time as the Siddhasara, the Jīvakapustaka, then the Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita also appears in Tibetan around the 11th century. They also then have a 13th century copy of the Yoga Shataka, and then finally to our Uyghur texts. So, as I mentioned in my introduction, the key article I found in examining the relationship of the Jīvakapustaka to other medical works is Emmerich's article, Contributions to the Study of Jīvakapustaka. In this, he goes through each of the 93 prescriptions that make up the text and lists each one that has parallels in other Indian medical texts. Some of them have only a single parallel, while other prescriptions can be found in multiple sources and clearly circulated widely. Of the 93, 29 have identified parallels elsewhere, which is an impressive accomplishment. Before Emmerich, Filioza had likewise made an attempt at this and had found only 5. So Emmerich greatly expanded our knowledge of this, but still, we're still only looking at a third of all of these prescriptions having actually had a parallel for it found. The pertinent point to come from Emmerich's work in this part of the paper is that 17 of them are parallels in the Siddhasara, 3 from Vagbhata's Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita, 1 from Madhava, 5 from Charaka, 1 from Shushruta, and 1 from Beda. There are also a smattering of often only 1 or 2 parallels coming from a range of texts such as the Yoga Ratna Kara, Yoga Ratna Samuchaya, the Gada Nigraha, the Chikitsa Sangraha, and the Amarakosha. One thing I find interesting to note is that all of these works cite prescriptions from an earlier text, namely the Yoga Shataka. Emmerich only identifies 3 prescriptions as being paralleled in the Nāvanītakam. As you'll gather from what I'm talking about today, I have found a number more. What's interesting about this partial breakdown that it does here is it's clear that the Siddhasara dominates the content or the parallels in the content of the Jīvakapustaka, and many come from sources which can trace their roots back to the Yoga Shataka. what there is very little presence for examples from the great classical works of Ayurveda directly. You know, one from Veda, one from Shushruta, 5 from Charaka. Now, as I say, I was quite inspired by Emmerich's article, and I was trying to familiarise myself for this paper I'd originally had in mind over a year ago about a general overview. So I decided it was time to familiarise myself with the Bauer manuscript, and that's when I started to spot these differences. So what was the method of doing that? Painful, in short. It's very hard to explain how you go about doing something like this. For anyone familiar with studying Sanskrit, for every word there are 50 different meanings, and for every concept there are 50 different words, almost always one of which is an epithet of Shiva. Just when you feel like you've cracked it, you discover that that word might describe a number of other very similarly related concepts, leaving you completely at sea with all the synonyms. And if this is difficult in Sanskrit most of the time, it's 100-fold more difficult when you're doing botanical terms. I mean, it is no exaggeration to say that plant names could have anywhere between 10 and 30 or even more synonyms, each of which needs to be cross-referenced, and those names may also be used to refer to more than one plant. So a plant could have multiple names, and the same name may be used to apply to multiple plants. On top of that, the Nāvanītakam is this non-classical mixed Sanskrit, so you're not always entirely sure that you're actually dealing with the same word that you would in classical Sanskrit. And comparing it further, when you're comparing to the Jīvakapustaka, you've additionally got the fact that the Sanskrit is incredibly poor, so it's not always easy to identify. The Cotanese portions, while written much better, are poorly written, and sometimes it's hard to know from the spelling whether or not you're getting at the same word. Then the vocabulary, though fairly often readily identifiable, nevertheless uses a mixture of Sanskrit, Prakrit, and native Cotanese names for plants. Similarly, the loanwords depend very much on which stage in the history of the Cotanese language they'd been adopted, and therefore aren't always as clearly from the Sanskrit source as possible. In addition to this, as you can see from the slide, you've got the challenge of translating a word from a known plant from the source language, say Sanskrit to the target language, transcribing the word for an unknown plant. You've got loaning the word for a plant from one language to another with all those philological considerations. Then you've got altering a word for metrical purposes, so just dropping syllables out of it to fit the rhythm. And then, of course, you've actually got the other issue, which is, from a very practical point of view, substitutions. Not all plants that you would find in North India will you find in the oasis cities of Central Asia or the mountains of Tibet. So plants themselves might actually be taken out of the prescription because they're not locally available and substituted with a regional substitute. So then you're not sure whether or not you're actually looking at a different term for the same plant or a different plant entirely. That's what it was involved in trying to pick through all of these prescriptions in the Jīvakapustaka and then look in the Nāvanītakam and go, is this prescription also here? One thing I'm not going to put you through, although perhaps some would enjoy it, but is to actually look at each and every one of the ones that I had found. In total, I found 8 prescriptions that I think are either identical or very closely correspond, and there are still up to another 10 which I think may correlate, but I still haven't got there in terms of sifting through all the various synonyms. Suffice to say, you can think of this as a kind of work in progress paper and a work of, so we say, slow progress. So to come on to actually look at some of what these are. Well, one thing I found, on top of all these linguistic complexities, is also the fact that in terms of what it's actually like to read the passages of these, they're not the most riveting kind of literature. That it will literally take the form of a long list of plant words without any grammatical nuance or separation, then a sentence maybe talking about quantities or relative proportions, a sentence or two about how to prepare them, and then a list of ailments that they treat, and then on to the next big long list of plant names. So that My graphical display here is an attempt to make it slightly more interesting to engage with. But let's take, for instance, the Vardhamana powder. We can see here on the left is the text from the Nāvanītakam. So Shukshmela, sugar, Vacha, Nagapushpa, Pipali, pepper, Nagara, Ela, which in the text it says simply are in progressively increasing quantities. Nāvanītakam doesn't actually say what the starting quantity is or what the rate of progression is. It's very vague on the details. All it does say is then you powder these and mix them with shakara, sugar, an equal quantity to the above, although we don't know what the quantity was above, so how we're meant to know it's the equal amount is hard to say, before going on to say that it cures indigestion, abdominal pains, abdominal tumours, piles, which is frequently the case in these texts, heart diseases, hiccough, asthma, and throat problems. It's a real good coverall. So what do we have in the Jīvakapustaka? Well, look, I usually see I've gone through a traffic light system to make it a bit more user-friendly. Sukshmila, Tvacha, Nagapushpa, Mirinja, Papala, Tungara, Shakara. What the Cotanese does, though, is actually give us some quantities, and they are progressively increasing from 1 manchanga to 4 to 5 to 6. 1 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6 does not make 7, as I'm sure many of you will have astutely observed. We definitely have some deviation there. However, let's look at the cures. Indigestion, abdominal swelling, arshas, heart disease, cough, respiratory illness, raktapitta, swollen belly, throat problems. It's an incredible amount of overlap. Let's look at a next example. Dashangagi. Now, here again, we have a long list of plants to refer to, Haritaki, Trikatuka, the 3 acrids. This comes up a lot in Indian pharmacy, and you see it a lot again in the Cotanese translations of both the Siddhasara and frequently in the Jīvakapustaka. Peppers, black peppers, Pipali, Tagara, Maricha. And as you can see, Papala, Tangara, Mijaratsa. 1 aksha each, 3 manchanga each. This is more or less an accurate equivalent. Metrology, as it's known, the study of weights and measures, is always a very complicated thing in the ancient world. It is in the second part of Emmerich's paper that he actually goes on to look at the units of measure and see how they compare. What he finds is it is inconsistent, that sometimes the unit of measure does correlate very accurately, and sometimes it doesn't. It's very hard to say whether this is through misunderstanding of what the unit of measure was meant to be, or whether actually it's a certain amount of creative freedom in how much quantity they actually use. So to come back to preparation method, all of those ingredients put together in Nāvanītakam and boiled up in some ghee, 1 prasta's worth. In the Jīvakapustaka, they're pounded and then cooked in, 1 spoon boiled in ghee, 2.5 chinga, equivalent to 1 prasta. And then tiranye, which is soured curds. That's clearly missing from the Sanskrit. It is often, though, added to some of the Central Asian prescriptions. They seem to have been quite fond of the soured curds. When it comes to cures, we have yet again a lot of overlap. I'm very fond of Hernley's wonderful translation, abdominal tumours from deranged wind. That never ceases to tickle me, that one. But of course, what he's talking about is the humoral medicine concept that existed at the time as wind as one of the humours. Spleen illnesses, cough, hiccough, and worms. We see exactly the same in the Jīvakapustaka. But what I found very interesting with this prescription in particular is that in the Nāvanītakam, it says it cures these things as a thunderbolt kills asuras. In the Jīvakapustaka, It cures them as a thunderbolt jewel bursts the hills. This is a lovely metaphor to suddenly throw in, but it's not, for texts that are very pragmatic, very practical in their details. This is an odd little flourish or finish to suddenly have, and yet both of them have it in very similar wording, almost as though the Jīvakapustaka had possibly got it from the Nāvanītakam. As I say, all of these ones that have parallels here, I have yet to find parallels in any other texts. I am not an Ayurvedic scholar, perhaps they are there, but certainly Emmerich didn't notice them in the other major works, and I'm inclined to trust to his scholarship. So if he had gone to all of those texts and not found them, then it begs the question, where else might these have come from if not just the Nāvanītakam? Finally, I'll just give you one more example of the type of thing that we get here. So the Shadava powder, this is one of the ones that has substantial number of ingredients, yet you can see here what I was talking about with some of the challenges you have. So Yavani is actually Samna in the Jīvakapustaka. If you go through all of the different synonyms you find and then consider a lot of the philological issues, slowly but surely you do actually start to find that, yes, there's some more obvious ones, Tintadika, Tintalika, some classical donations in there, but actually this is a very close correlation, except for this additional ingredient they have here in Jīvakapustaka, Valigaradza. So all of that first lot, you have one kasha each. A kasha, in this instance, definitely does equal 2.5 manchanga. The second batch of ingredients that you're putting together have half a kasha each, and 1.5 is a close enough approximation of 2.5. So I give that an amber. And then finally, for the acrids, 100, 200, 400 pala, and we certainly have 100 seeds, 200 seeds, and then 8 sera. 8 sera does not correlate to 400 pala in other texts, but as I say, units of weights and measures seem to be pretty flexible in this particular genre. Again, though, the cures are pretty much identical across the board. So, what have we got here? To try and come to some general conclusions. I have a terrible habit of doing this with most topics, but I do feel like it's the most intellectually honest thing to say. In conclusion, it's very hard to draw any strong conclusions about what the relationship between the Jīvakapustaka and the Nāvanītakam might be. As I've already said, it really is a weird manuscript. I've spent the better part of 3 years now looking at the Jīvakapustaka, and I've had all sorts of thoughts about what it might be, ranging from the singular instance preserving an otherwise lost medical text, through to the work of the equivalent of some kind of local GP compiling a bunch of pharmaceutical prescriptions that he finds particularly useful to note down, through to looking at the terrible handwriting. And I mean, in fact, the terrible handwriting is another reason to think it might have been a doctor, if it modern doctor's prescriptions or anything to go by. But given the terrible Sanskrit, maybe it's just work of some Dunhuang medical student. I really don't know. They are some 600 to 800 years apart, these two texts. And because we know that the Jīvakapustaka is incomplete, it's impossible to say how much more material it might have had. In fact, if there were more, would we find any even greater correlation with the Nāvanītaka? It's certainly interesting that they share a structure, and this structure is unusual compared with other Indian works in an Indian context. I do think this chapter structuring around the base is one of the strongest reasons to think there might be a relationship between the two. It's also interesting to note, as mentioned earlier, that what I found so far in terms of parallel prescriptions, the Nāvanītaka as a source would almost completely eliminate the need to refer directly to Charaka, Shushruta, or Veda as sources for what we find in the Jīvakapustaka. So I think maybe you've got these very early major Indian works before they've taken a fully formalized structure and are a pool of working knowledge in the development of Ayurvedic theory in India at the time, filtering their way into whatever it is the Bauer manuscript and the Nāvanītakam in particular are, and that in its turn, The Nāvanītakam, along with things like the Siddhasara and the Jīvakapustaka, is in itself a distillation of a lot of other works that Emmerich found parallels to, are brought together into a compilation in the Jīvakapustaka. Since there's not been to date a discovery of recensions of any of these classical works, by which I mean Charaka, Shushruta, Beda, anywhere in Central Asia, it does seem more reasonable to posit that the Nāvanītaka, having been copied at least near Kutcha, could have been a more familiar part of the medical textual tradition in the region. The absence of evidence is of course not proof, and I'm not suggesting that we can claim that none of the classical authors' works circulated in Central Asia, but I think it is important to divorce ourselves from a number of ideas about Ayurveda as a monolith of Indian medicine in general, and about the medical textual transmission in the context of Central Asia. The Silk Roads in general, and Dunhuang in particular, were immensely multicultural, and I think this would have had a considerable influence over the reception of these very practical texts, such that medical texts are. All of the manuscripts of sufficient length to be identifiable, that is, Bhagavata's Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita, Ravi Gupta's Siddhasara, and Nagarjuna's Yogashataka, are medical works with Buddhist authors who probably hailed from Gandhara and the northwest regions, or at least would have studied and practiced there at some time. As already mentioned, a lot of the text from which Emmerich identifies parallels in the Jīvakapustaka can also be traced back to the Yogashataka as a source. It's hard to ignore that only a small corpus of Buddhist composed medical treatises from the northwestern regions is needed to account for almost everything that's known of Indian medical practices on the Silk Roads. In essence, I think a large body of medical knowledge accrued over centuries in India was circulating without any rigid formalization at this point. I don't think there was a canon of medicine, so to speak, at least not in the Central Asian context. Tactula University in the Greco-Buddhist state of Gandhara was at the forefront of medical teaching and practice at this time. Learned monks of many different schools from a wide range of India and wide range of backgrounds from the surrounding regions came there to advance knowledge. But given where Tactula was situated, there certainly would have been a preponderance of Buddhists. This is where the likes of probably Bhagavata and Ravi Gupta were, and their cutting-edge medical works were what monks, their students and pilgrims would have taken with them as they set off onto the Silk Roads, bringing the contents of these works to Central Asia and beyond. Sorry, the reason I put that slide up as well next is to say, I've been talking about the medical works and the great medical texts, but of course, they're not the only sources of medical knowledge, and this list is an example of that. This is all of the Buddhist texts that I am aware of that I've managed to find, which have some medical content in them, and that includes the Dhammapada, the Jatakamala, Milandapanya, like these are Buddha Charita. These are quite a wide range of texts. Even the Vinaya has bits of medicine in it. So medical knowledge is scattered all around. No one has as yet, and it's something I would dearly love to find the time and resources to do, is actually see whether or not any of these unidentified prescriptions actually have parallels in any of these non-medical texts, so to speak. I think to just speak more broadly and generally here, medicine is a fundamentally rather practical discipline, and it was important to translate these works into regional languages because people in the region need to be able to understand them in order to treat their ailments. Bilingual editions are particularly useful in monasteries, where we have bilingual works in Sanskrit and Cotanese, Takeri and Uyghur. What's interesting is that the material in the Sanskrit source is often greatly expanded upon. As I mentioned earlier in relation to the Jīvakapustaka, this is normally in the form of additional information about weights and measures and preparation processes. So to kind of round on this point, don't take my word for it, let's consider what scholars have said about the various Central Asian medical works that have been preserved. So on the subject of Takerian medicine, Carling says, the Takerian texts provide a relatively free translation in relation to the Sanskrit original, which is given in the text. Normally, the information in the Sanskrit text is expanded by practical information in the Takerian translation. So what are Cotanese? Well, Emmerich says, in both cases, the Cotanese translation of in both cases, the Cotanese translations are more elaborate than the Sanskrit original. In the case of the Siddhasara, this is accounted for by the fact the translation follows the Tibetan closely, and the Tibetan rendering includes much explanatory and commentarial matter. And also, the most striking feature of the Khotanese translation of Jīvakapustaka is the insistence on specifying in each instance the appropriate quantity of each drug and the amount of milk, water, or oil required, even when those items are not found in the Sanskrit original. So what of Uyghur? Well, Peter Zima says the Uyghur translation deviates considerably, but it exploits the medical knowledge, as this also it describes in other sources in just this way. And Dietrich Mauer says, perhaps the following consideration may help to understand the case. Medical handbooks and collections of prescriptions were destined for practical purposes. As the number of translations increased, the original texts grew more and more dispensable, and accordingly their number decreased. Precise reproductions of text then does not seem to be a major consideration for the authors and compilators of medical works along the Silk Roads. I think it's important in this respect that we do not think of medical texts in the same way that we would canonical works, which must be faithfully reproduced, not only to preserve religious teaching, but also to gain merit. Medical texts are there to transmit knowledge about illness and treatment, but that can vary considerably for numerous reasons. At basic level, this may come down to substitutions for plants not available in the region for climatic reasons, or through conventional reasons of change, such as misreadings or slightly different recensions. But more than this, we need to think about medical practice as just that, the practical application of medical theory, established procedures, and tested remedies to the treatment of real ailments being experienced by real people. The merit in passing on medical knowledge is in using it to alleviate suffering, and accordingly, its efficacy over fidelity that is really important. I think this creates a space for innovation, and I think this may be what we're seeing in the evolution of medical practices through these manuscripts. As I say, it's very hard to draw strong conclusions when what you're looking at are very fragmentary texts. You don't have the full picture. You don't know how much of it was passed along. With something like the Yoga Shataka, you don't know whether or not the theory was floating around as well as simply the prescriptions in these texts. But everything we do have seems to suggest that the primary concern of the peoples on the Silk Roads was with that practical pharmaceutical knowledge and instructions on how to assemble the ingredients, prepare them correctly, and what to use them to treat. And that's what the manuscript evidence points us to. And that's what I think we should really be thinking about when we consider medical works. So on that note, I'll finish there and we'll open this up to questions and discussion, because I'm sure there are many of you out there who will have all sorts of insight to share that I don't have answers to myself.
All right, Matt, thank you so much for that excellent paper. Oh, that was fascinating. Enjoyed every minute of it. We do have questions. They are coming in. And just as a note to everyone watching, I'd like to remind you, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A bubble down at the bottom of your screen, the bottom right-hand corner, and we'll be able to address them there. I saw some people raising hands earlier, so make sure you just transfer those raised hands over to the Q&A bubble. Thank you. All right. Our first question, where would Khotan, to return to your slides, where would Khotan be on the map precisely?
Yeah, you know, I was just going to that now. Let me bring the map up for you a moment. I'll try and say what I see, and you can see if you can spot it there.
Sorry to make you bring it back again.
No, there we go. I'll get myself out of that mess there. Right. Sorry. Right. So you can see the large area marked out as Tibetan Empire. Going north of where the text is from there and off slightly to the left, capitalizes Khotan. It's also just beneath the label for Tactula Desert. So it's the lower left part of the Tactula Desert, there to the southwest. And as I mentioned, the other cities there, Dunhuang, Nia, Yotkan, in which the Cotanese clearly exerted substantial cultural influence. Other places I was talking about, so on the north route, so if you look north of that label Khotan, you'll see in the northern route Kutcha, and then further off, way out east, there's Dunhuang, just by the Hixi corridor. So yeah, I'll leave that out there for a minute if you like, just so you can have a look.
Excellent. Thank you. We have a question related to this, which is, have you been to these sites?
Oh, I wish. Oh, how I wish. And no, sadly not. Though I would deeply love to have the opportunity to actually go and see. I think there is something it gives you into a certain understanding and insight to see the places. One thing I'd love to do is really go on a good old botanical survey. I envy anyone who gets to go out in the field and actually go, well, what plants have we got in the region? What is sustainable? I'm sure such research does get done, but I'm not familiar with the botanical and pharmaceutical literature. But no, alas, I've not been there yet.
Okay. You have to join us in Dunhuang someday, and then
Yeah.
parts farther west.
I'd very much like to.
Most welcome. Please do. We have a question, a more specific one. Do any of the manuscripts speak specifically about patients, so particular patients, and the medicines given for a particular illness? So basically, are these general prescriptions, or did any of them deal with a particular patient?
Yeah, no, there never seems to be any mention of really specific patients in any of these works. What I think they are is kind of a doctor's handbook, essentially. And doctor in this case, I think we're probably almost certainly talking about them being monks in this context. These are the people who are bringing the text and the knowledge with them on the road. That's not to say that I don't think that traders would no doubt have picked up knowledge. You're living going around back and forth on the Silk Roads. You're going to have medical mishaps. You're going to acquire some general knowledge. It's like we all have, we'll have a bit of basic first aid knowledge, or we all know, a dock leaf's very good for rubbing on a sting or something like that. So yeah, that kind of knowledge might have circulated, but the monks would have been the custodians of this detailed textual knowledge, and therefore, in that sense, they were the doctors who would have been there. And so I think what you really got was, and I think who was it that said it? I think it was from those quotes I was giving you. Sorry, isn't it? Look at my notes. Yeah, it was Dietrich Maurer who said it. As the number of translations increased, the original texts grew more and more dispensable, and accordingly their number decreased. That actually what was useful was just having a list of, right, if you've got these ailments, here's the ingredients you need, and here's how to prepare them. So what we don't have is, when I was mocking doctors' prescriptions, we don't have an actual, nobody seemed to write down a prescription and take it to a dispensary, because presumably that dispensary was also the monastery. I'd be very interested to know, and this is one of the reasons why it's great to visit sites, whether or not actually whether any archaeologists have ever found collections of specimens of dried plants and goods in monasteries. That's something it'd be really interesting me to know. Sorry, the questions are racking up.
Yeah, you noticed as well. All right, so we'll segue to the next one. Thank you, Matt. So thank you for your fascinating talk. 2 questions in one. The first is, you mentioned that the Cotanese parts of the manuscript add practical information, such as precise measures, etc. Is this part of a process of cultural adaptation? And the second part is, would you say the scribe and the author of the manuscript are the same person, or are they different people?
Good, awkward questions. Thank you. As to question 1, is it part of the process of cultural adaptation? Yes, I think so. I just think, I can read the Tacarian, I can read the Cotanese, I can read the Sanskrit and the Prakrit. I take Fitzsima and Dietrich Maurer's word on the Uyghur, but it really does seem to have been a cultural practice, not specifically just the Cotanese, but of people in that region in general, to present their medical information in that way, that it moved away from the feel and style of Indian text, that kind of canonical way of arranging things that is passed with a high degree of accuracy. So yeah, I think getting into the specifics, because you need to know the specifics. Let's think, this is real medical knowledge and real medical practice for these people. It's no use saying progressively increasing quantities and not giving you a quantity. So they pin it down. They say, well, this amount and this amount and this amount. Otherwise, it's just kind of abstract theoretical medical knowledge, which doesn't do you much good. So yeah, I do think it's cultural adaptation. As to the second question, are the scribe and the author the same person? This one really bugs me. If I were to go on my instincts, and as I say, I have spent nearly 3 years on this text, this one text in the main, I think they are. I think this thing, well, you know, I would say I'm worried I'm going to get ferociously challenged on this, but I don't think anyone else has bothered spending much time ever looking at the Jīvakapustaka since Emmerich did.
Might be safe.
Yes, you know, for now. I think the author is the scribe. I think they were not a monk. I think they were, just based on the terrible Sanskrit, the loose hand, that this was somebody doing this for possibly their own specific purpose, drawing on multiple sources. I think it is an original compilation in action, because there is just such an interesting mix of texts that it's drawing upon. And as I say, it's a third of all the prescriptions in it are actually identifiable from known major Indic sources. Now, although I can't identify what those other sources are at this point, what I could say is, at least it's not from Chinese medicine. It certainly doesn't appear to be from Chinese medicine, but because the plant names are still Indic, so it suggests it is coming from Indic sources. But then the Nāvanītakam itself doesn't seem to be complete. So, yeah, I think that there is a real relationship between the two. And I think whoever the author of the Jīvakapustaka was, what we're getting to see is a new bit of work forming in action. And I think for all of us familiar with the text of the Silk Road, there are all sorts of these wonderful, unique oddities that come from there that come from nowhere else. So that's how I like to imagine it anyway.
That's a great framework for looking at it. Thank you, Matt. So this is more of a specifically related to the slides question. First of all, will the slides be available after this lecture? The answer is yes. We're going to put this on YouTube. Second, if not, can you please show the 31 melody slides so I can take a screenshot?
Yeah, I'm perfectly happy to circulate this afterwards. Let me just find what that slide was. Melodies. It
was a very lively slide, I remember.
Was it these the actual prescriptions themselves that I had up there?
I think it may have been that one with the descriptions, very graphic descriptions of various ailments.
Yeah. Oh, medicine is quite the topic to get into. I spared you some of the worst. Believe me.
I appreciate it.
I think perhaps these were the ones meant. Oh, sorry.
This one, yes.
Was this it?
It may have been the earlier one where it mentioned all the various things that could happen. I think it was a little bit earlier. This one.
Yes.
This
the
one.
Chapter of Siddhasara. Yes. Yeah, that's a great one, isn't it?
I hope that helps. William is the person who asked the question, so I hope you were able to get a screenshot, but we will have this up on YouTube, so you will be able to pause it later. So to get back to the specific content, thank you for the presentation. Do we know anything about systems of apprenticeship in medical practice at this point? That is there any indication of the practical knowledge of compounding medicine that's so well established in practice that the measures don't need to be written down, such as recipes for cooking?
Yeah, that's really interesting. No, I don't know anything about any degree of kind of apprenticeship or training that would have happened in Central Asia. But I think the point you make there is a really good one, and one I would concur with, that when you're back in the great city, as I say, like Tactula, where, it was almost certainly where a lot of these texts were being composed, or at least, you had all the foremost philosophers and religious scholars and doctors and astrologers, all there, all these great minds from all these different traditions from all across the subcontinent, living together, working together, debating together, creating the forefront of knowledge there. And I suspect actually there and in the great metropolises within India and the rest of the subcontinent, actually it was perhaps so commonplace, so well known, and given the extent to which texts were learnt by heart and you had to recite it by heart over and over, that the knowledge was committed to memory, it was commonplace, it was just understood and known. But as this stuff gets disseminated further and further north, that actually all the surrounding learning around it and the kind of social and cultural context that made this norm wasn't necessarily there. Text might come in dribs and drabs via a trader or a monk, and the text may go out again. We don't really know, but I do think, yeah, probably it was necessary to document things like quantity and preparation process in more detail there, simply because you didn't have the general. So I'm drawing far too much on the kind of modern academic analogy, but you didn't have that kind of scholarly context in which those texts existed that made it unnecessary to get into such detail.
No, it's an excellent answer.
Mm.
We have another a compliment. Thank you for this great lecture. Have you studied Arab prescriptions of the Arabian Caliphate? Are there parallels or influences from there too, and maybe later that were maybe later transferred to the Mediterranean?
No, I haven't. Really good question, thank you. Again, this is for the same reason that I haven't really gone into Chinese and Tibetan sources. It's just my own linguistic inadequacy there. Unfortunately, I can't read the material. However, the phenomenal scholar that he was, of course, Emmerich could. And it's Emmerich who actually first sheds light on the fact that content of the Siddhasara made its way into the Arab medical tradition. And of course, as we know, so much of the knowledge that Europe's intellectual history is built on, in fact, comes from the Islamic world. It's of course it was very famous. If it weren't for the Islamic world, we'd have lost most of classical Greek knowledge. What I don't talk about is what an enormous role it also played, the Islamic world, in interfacing between East and West, so to speak. That a huge amount of Indian medical knowledge actually passes west through the Caliphate. I'd love to be able to access it more, because I think there is probably more than we realise in that kind of, at least Indo-Persian medical tradition. So thank you for asking that, because I think it's a really important point. We have these silos, we talk about European biomedicine and Arabic medicine and Indian medicine and Chinese medicine and Tibetan medicine. And it's just, when you dig into it and when you start looking at these, the little kingdoms of Khotan and the Tacarians, that you realize, God, there's this huge amount of intellectual exchange. I mean, we're all enthusiasts of the Silk Road here. So that's one thing we can definitely say we've all got. And so, it's preaching to the choir, I guess, but it cannot be understated how much the Silk Roads are a melting pot of intellectual traditions, and that there was such a dynamic exchange of thought and knowledge going on that modern history has, from its Eurocentric bias, I think, really concealed so much of the time. Sorry, I'll stop on that one now. No one needs me to say it.
No, exactly. I 100% agree. Coming from studying the Chinese tradition, it's fascinating to understand how much exchange there really was that isn't often acknowledged or even credited.
Yeah.
So, to get back to the topic of Ayurveda, it says you mentioned you're unfamiliar with Ayurveda. I'm curious if these, it must be these recipes are in use to date in monasteries, for example, or if they're part of Ayurveda.
Really good question. I would imagine yes, actually. I don't know, but I would expect so, because enough of them come from the classical authoritative works, which have continued in such a long tradition, that I can't imagine any reason why they wouldn't still form a part of modern Ayurvedic practice. As I say, it's not an area I know in depth, and the reason is it's vast. It's Ayurvedic medicine is enormous, and it's been hard enough to get a handle on, scant references to prescriptions in one weird little manuscript from Dunhuang, let alone to try and tackle the behemoth of Ayurvedic medicine. but equally, as I say, I think today Ayurvedic medicine is a very clearly defined tradition, and it has a very clear historical lineage. But personally, I'd like to, when I think about what the situation of medical knowledge was, certainly in the first half of the millennium, yes, Ayurvedic medicine had definitely taken shape and become a formalized system. I have enormous respect for work of people like Kenneth Zisk and Pierre Salguero, who look at the idea of Buddhist medical tradition and Buddhist medicine. But I wouldn't want to attach myself too strongly to that monolith either. I don't think there was some formalized Buddhist medical tradition or canon either. I think there was lively medical debate and a lot of knowledge and information, and a lot of, because so much of it is medicinal botany, so much is produced from a highly localized context and then circulated more widely, that yes, I think this material survives in modern Ayurveda, but I don't think necessarily people practicing it then would have thought that they were practicing Ayurveda in all instances.
Excellent. Yes, you saw it too. Do we have any bibliographic information on Emirate?
Yeah, good question. In perfect candor, I was really losing steam as it came to trying to finish off my PowerPoint, which, was done in a very timely fashion, because I wouldn't want to be like everyone else in the history of academia and cultural heritage, is, putting the finishing touches on in the last hour. But I didn't get as far as my bibliography slide. However, what I am going to do is point you towards an excellent online resource for this and many other things. It's called Encyclopedia Iranica. It's fantastic. I mean, it extends a huge range of subjects. I have used it as a go-to again and again and again. Now, I'm just trying to look at how I can post. Can I post? Can I ask a question and then post it?
You can't post, but you can share screen. The other thing you could do is, if you send it to me, I'll make sure that it goes out.
Okay, we'll do that with the slides.
Yeah, with the newsletter. So when we send out the update that the video of this talk has been uploaded to YouTube, I'll also circulate it in the materials in that newsletter.
Actually, Melody's just popped it into the
Thank
chat.
You, Melody.
Thanks, Melody. And thank you for all the help with the printer and everything else beforehand too. It's good to have a colleague on hand nearby.
Friend in need is a friend indeed. Same for a colleague.
Absolutely. But Mauro Maggi, who I mentioned earlier, who's a truly great scholar of Cotanese and indeed Buddhist studies, and he's the guy who did the work on the poultices and has picked up a lot of Emmerich's work on medical material. I mean, he, far more than I, is the go-to man on Cotanese medicine, but he's written a lot of excellent articles for Encyclopedia Iranica, including just a potted bibliography of Emmerich, which it's huge. I mean, honestly, I spent about the first 6 months in my research curator post just trying to find almost everything Emmerich had ever written. There's a lot of it, and it is fantastic work. He's was a really incredibly insightful scholar. He advanced this field leaps and bounds. One of those truly erudite individuals.
Right. One of Paul Pellios of his generation.
Yes, really was. And he also followed in the footsteps of Harold Bailey, who was, I mean, Hernley's the guy who never gets the credit he deserves for cracking Cotanese and giving us the first insights into that. And Harold Bailey is the man who, dutifully went and edited all of those texts and presented the 5 volumes of Cotanese texts, all transliterated and partially edited. Wonderful volumes, all worth consulting. I'll probably include those in some of the bibliographic information I sent over to you as well.
Perfect. I would love that. So everybody, please stay tuned.
I'll do a bibliography slide and I'll add it to the presentation and send it round.
That would be excellent. We'd be overjoyed to include all that information. So everybody, please stay tuned for the upload announcement, and all of this bibliographic information will be featured there.
References forthcoming.
References forthcoming. So, all right. Well, if there are no further questions, Matt, thank you so much for being here with us today and for discussing this fascinating transmission of medical information along the Silk Roads and how it adapted as it went. I was especially intrigued to learn just what types of information were in circulation, and also your idea that medical efficacy could be a form of merit making. How it was able to substitute for that in the Buddhist tradition, that's fascinating. I had never thought of it that way. So really, we can't thank you enough for coming and sharing these ideas with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be part of this series of lectures. So thank you very much, and thank you to the Dunhuang Foundation.
Well, the pleasure has been all ours. To everybody out there, as a note, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we're going to be on summer hiatus for the next few months. So happy summer, everyone. And we're going to return this fall with a new webinar series. So that will be called Art, Environment, and Materiality Along the Silk Roads. This series will be curated by Professor Anne Fung of Boston University, and it will address the intersection between art and cultures of the Silk Roads and new research in the fields of environmental studies and theories of materials. So once again, that will be taking place early this fall, and further information is forthcoming. Over the summer, in the interim, to tide everybody over, we'll be sending out a link to a virtual tour of Mogao Caves 158, 275, 285, and 428. This was created for us by our talented VR team of Eric Hansen and Greg Downing. Some of you may remember Eric from our Jewish Merchants on the Ancient Silk Roads webinar back in March. So we invite you to take this virtual tour and to explore the caves in all of their rich detail. It's truly a work of art. So please be on the lookout for that link as well over the next few weeks. So to our viewers, sincere thanks for joining us on this journey across the Silk Roads throughout late last year and into this year. We greatly appreciate you and your encouragement, especially during the very difficult times in which we find ourselves globally. Once more, I'd like to thank Matt. Thank you, Matt, and to wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. Until next time.